Hello and welcome to the last section on Chapter 3 of the America and the Great War. We're going to be covering the 14 points, Disarm Germany all the way through Betrayal, Great Expectations. We're going to wrap up World War I and kind of set the table for World War II a little bit today as well. And so Germany, facing invasion by the Allies, the Kaiser advocates his throne days before the official surrender, gives up his throne. Germany becomes a republic, becomes a democracy under the Weimar Republic, and so they surrender on November 11th, 1918, after the Kaiser left and fled to Holland. The guns of World War I fell silent on the 11th hour, the 11th day, the 11th month in 1918, and which became Armistice Day for years, and then after World War II it was changed to Veterans Day to honor our men who fought in all foreign wars. 9 million soldiers were killed, and which really was kind of an eye-opening thing was 20 million civilians. 20 million were wounded. There was the first war ever that there was more death due to combat than disease. There were 7 million civilians who died, and so civilians, which had largely been left out of war in history before that, were caught in the crossfire of these terrible machines and awful agents of war, weapons that were created during this time. 30 million actually died from a worldwide flu epidemic the following year. Kind of like a double whammy. You have the bloodiest war in history to that point, and then the worst flu epidemic in the history of mankind at that time, or in modern history, killing 30 million people. Here in America, towns quarantined themselves from each other to prevent that flu from spreading. 550,000 Americans died in the war. From the influenza, I should say. Not from the war, not that high. The United States' main contribution to the victory was food, munitions, credit, oil, and manpower, and also just a boost in confidence. The Americans only fought in 2 major battles, St. Mihiel, I can't say it, I'm sorry, and the Battle of Meuse-Argonne. But the prospect of endless American troops rather than the actual performance is really what deterred Germany from keeping fighting. To make sure that Germany didn't want to keep fighting, they quit instead of having their own nation destroyed. Pershing had to actually purchase supplies in Europe because of shipping problems, but the idea that the Americans were just showing up, they were just starting to get to full strength, and they were going to just keep coming and coming. The Germans didn't want to keep fighting. This is a political cartoon, kind of a prophetic one, from 1918 called German Repentance. Well, it didn't pay, and it says not this time. They're setting up a sequel. You guys know when you watch movies, they set up sequels. This is Home from the War 1919. Shows a member of the 369th Colored Infantry, better known as the Harlem Hellfighters. They're in his parade shows that he gave his leg to help fight for the cause of freedom and end the German tyranny of imperialism. So Wilson gained a lot of support throughout the world because he was viewed as the moral leader of the Allies. There's congressional elections, midterm elections at the end of the war, right around the same time. In November 1918, Wilson asked the public to re-elect a Democratic majority to Congress. It didn't happen. Voters instead elected Republicans as a majority to Congress, which is going to be bad news for Wilson in terms of a peace treaty, in terms of getting things done and shaping the world like he wanted with his 14 points. Wilson decides to go to Paris. He's the first American sitting president, to actually leave the country while in office, which seems like our presidents are out of the country all the time now. And so he wanted to go in person, infuriated Republicans, because he thought that's the job of the Secretary of State, the State Department, not the president. The president shouldn't be leaving the country and doing his own thing. And so Republicans are pretty upset by that. No president had ever traveled to Europe, especially a sitting president. And he didn't invite any Republicans to Paris. That's, kind of rubbed it in their face a little bit. And so his main opposition in the Senate is Francis Cabot Lodge here. So he shows up, the Paris conference, and, he shows up to cries of long live Wilson, and he's a hero. The Paris Peace Conference was dominated by the Big Four. The United States with Wilson. You have Vittorio Orlando from Italy. You have David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, and Georges Clemenceau, the Premier of France. So these are the Big Four that kind of dominate this whole thing. Wilson tried to stop the victors from taking the losers' colonies. This is where the old saying that, Americans go to war for souvenirs maybe started. Instead, they became trustees of the land through the League of Nations was his proposal. His ultimate goal, and he'll cave on all 14 points except that last one, is the creation of a League of Nations to prevent future wars. In February 1919, the Big Four agreed to the creation of the League of Nations, and the treaty And that's probably the only positive that Wilson got out of this treaty. This is a picture of Wilson arriving in Dover, which is in England. Like I said, he was given a hero's welcome. No president had ever traveled to Europe while in office, and so it was kind of a big deal for the American president, who helped save the day for the Allies. So the treaty, some Republicans in America hated the idea of this League of Nations, and they threatened to not approve the treaty. Under the Constitution, the president can sign treaties, but the Senate ultimately has to approve it. And that's our system of checks and balances there. The difficulties helped Wilson's allied adversaries in Paris because they were given a stronger bargaining position. Knowing that Wilson didn't have universal support back home, kind of let them have their way with Wilson. Wilson would have to beg them for changes in the treaty that would safeguard the Monroe Doctrine and other American interests. And so some of the other things, the French give up their claim in the Saar Valley. In exchange for this, Britain and America agreed to a security treaty. Basically, they would defend France if Germany ever invaded again. Yeah, we didn't uphold that in 1940. Our bad. Italy demanded Fiume, a valuable seaport inhabited by both Italians and Yugoslavs. Wilson wanted to go to Yugoslavia. Japan demanded China's Shandong Peninsula and the German islands in the Pacific, which they'd seized during the war. Japan threatened to walk out. Wilson accepted a compromise. Let's get to the actual treaty, which is one of the worst treaties in history, according to historians, the Treaty of Versailles. One, Russia and Germany are not invited. That's kind of a problem. They're kind of negotiating. I mean, Russia already signed his treaty, but they're negotiating the punishment of Germany, and they're not allowed. France, Britain, and the United States send troops to the Russian Civil War to prevent supplies getting in the hands of the Bolsheviks. Public outcry was not positive towards that, so they pulled them out pretty quickly. Only one of the 14 points actually lasted. And so Wilson's very idealistic, wants to save the world and fix everything, and the French just want revenge. They want punishment. Germany was left unscathed, largely because of the war, and most of the damage, most of the devastation happened in the French countryside. And so their perspective is we need to take Germany to the woodshed, and they do that with this treaty. For one, Germany takes the official blame for the war. They have to sign a treaty saying, officially, my bad. The war was solely their blame, even though historians, and you probably know from the earlier lessons, it's not really their fault. They had to pay war reparations, not just money, but materials as well. $32 billion worth of reparations were required in their treaty, which equates to $442 billion today. Germany actually paid those back in 2010. There was a slight pause when the Nazis came to power. They refused to pay them. They also had to ship coal, steel, timber, agricultural items, and they had to allow intellectual property to the world. The Bayer Corporation, which invented aspirin, had to give up their secret formula. Kind of absurd. I mean, like somebody defeating America in a war and demanding the recipe for Coca-Cola, but it happened. Everyone got aspirin, and Taiwan was probably started because of this treaty. Germany lost all of its colonies. France occupies the Rhineland and took Alsace and Lorraine from the Germans. They had to disarm. They were allowed to have less than 100,000 troops. They were not to have a large navy anymore. They were not allowed to have an air force, tanks, submarines, or no new machine guns. Basically, they can have kind of a ceremonial, very small band of men to protect Germany. They also created new empires, new countries out of the fallen empires. You have the fall of the German Empire, the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire is on the ropes. And so they create all these new countries, which you're going to see on the map here in a moment. And so you have also you have the fall of the Russian Empire as well, who's in the middle of a civil war. And then lastly, the League of Nations is created. All of this, and this is in Germany, it can be seen as a pro-Hitler argument, created a climate that was so desperate for change that people turned to anyone, including Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Many historians point to that. I had a German exchange student told me that that's kind of how the pro-Nazi people argue in Germany, so I'm not sure what's going on. So here's some of the new countries. You have Poland. Hey, look at that. Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. You have Eastern Prussia, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary. You have Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria. Bulgaria was already there. And Albania and Greece, all created. Kind of cool stuff. So critics of the League of Nations came from many different political groups in America. The Italians, the Germans, the Irish, the isolationists, the Republicans. They did not like it. And so this is Wilson here getting married to foreign entanglements in this League of Nations. And basically America didn't get anything out of that war, out of that treaty, except for thousands of dead Americans. And so Americans felt shorted. Like, why did we get involved? Let's just go back to hanging out on our own, isolationist, and, we're using our two oceans to protect us. And so Americans felt shorted. The Senate did not want to ratify the treaty. Their opposition was headed by Henry Cabot Lodge. He hoped to drag the treaty discussions out and modify it, and hoped to tweak it. Wilson went on a barn stop or a whistle stop tour to gain support from the people directly for his treaty. While in Pueblo, Colorado, in the state I live in, he suffered a massive stroke, lost the ability to speak and walk, and was bedridden for the last year and a half of his presidency. And so it was kind of a huge blow to the treaty that Wilson couldn't fight for it himself. And so he was bedridden. Most of the day-to-day activities of the White House were actually ran by his wife. Senator Lodge, a critic of the president, came up with 14 reservations to the Treaty of Versailles. His additions to the treaty forced Wilson to denounce it to Democrats, and it's rejected twice. The United States never ratifies it. The United States never joins the League of Nations. In fact, the U.S. signed separate treaties with the belligerent nations of World War I in 1921. The U.S. goes back to just being a hermit, keeping to ourselves. Henry Cabot Lodge was not sorry, Wilson. He was sorry what the meme says. He got what he wanted. So he decides to settle the treaty issue with the presidential campaign in 1920. Though he can't speak, he's still directing things behind the scenes. And so if voters elected a Democrat, this would mean they supported the treaty. And so there was still hope for him. The Republicans chose Senator Warren G. Harding of Ohio and Governor Calvin Coolidge of Massachusetts to run for the ticket. The Republican platform appealed to both pro-League and anti-League sentiment in the party. They pretty smart in what they did. The Democrats nominated pro-League Governor James M. Cox and a young up-and-coming politician from New York, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, for vice president. Harding wins the election in 1920. This is the first one in which women were allowed to vote nationally. And it basically was the end of the League of Nations. So even though the Senate rejects it, there was still a glimmer of hope that if the Democrats could win the presidency, that maybe they could bring it back, but it's gone. There's a PBS video you can watch on your own. Here's the electoral map of 1920, in which the Republican Warren G. Harding kind of wins most of the North, including one state in the South, Tennessee there. So after World War I, America became isolationist, went back to its old ways, and did not embrace the role of global leader, even though it was up and coming, probably one of the most powerful countries in the world. With interest of its own security, the U.S. should have used its enormous strength to shape the world. Instead, because America turns its back, you can argue that these empires, these new dictators rise and help cause World War II. And so it allows the world to drift towards another war because America was indifferent. America was a part of the Roaring '20s and just wanted to have a good time. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll see you in the next chapter.